Welcome back to a new tournament game analysis video. Today we're going to be covering round number 4 in another Excelsior tournament. So I'm playing again with the white pieces against a 2100. Let's see how it goes. I play e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, and we end up trading on d4. And after knight f6 and knight to c3, my opponent plays the Najdorf variation. I had heard around that time that this person was preparing for me, and they were actually not sure whether to expect rook to g1 or the move bishop to g5, where we would get some sort of poison pawn variation. At the time, I was no longer playing bishop g5, so that wasn't on my mind. So I was just deeply preparing this version of the Najdorf, rook to g1. The whole point of this move is that it's incredibly unpopular, but it's objectively no worse than any of the main lines you may see, from bishop to g5 to e3 to even a move like f3 or a3 or h3. There's so many moves against the Najdorf variation that you could almost play anything and be okay. And rook to g1 does have some ideas behind it. Mainly the idea is that if we end up getting to castle long, this rook on g1 actually does help a little bit with moves like g4 and g5. We're trying to displace this knight on f6 so we can get more of a central control and be aggressive right off the bat. But it doesn't really look so great in the first place, so it's also something that your opponents may underestimate. We see the move e5, knight to b3, and bishop to e6. So this signals that my opponent is clearly going for some sort of endgame, as after g4 and d5, we don't really have much of a choice. We have to take on d5 a bunch and accept that this is what we're having. But this endgame isn't actually so bad for white, and I'm decently happy to play it. After all, just a few games ago, I ended up beating a national master in this opening from the white side, and I'm ready to try to do it again. So after knight to c6, I played c3, and after castles, I played knight to d2. And when I talked to my opponent after this game, he mentioned that he was out of prep at this point because he only saw that online games, sometimes I would just castle long, which isn't really the approach that I would go for in tournament games. Now, we see bishop to e7. I go a4, just my typical setup. The whole point here is we're trying to potentially trade off something on c4. Bishop c4 is going to be the next move. And then we can play moves like king to e2, and we're just happy to play some sort of endgame where my pieces may be slightly better placed than theirs, and that's about it. So we see king to b8, I go bishop to c4, and they go h6, signaling the move bishop to g5. I go king to e2, and they do go bishop to g5 now. And again, I have a choice. I could actually take on d5, or I could play something else. I ended up playing rook g to d1, but if I take on d5, it's pretty interesting. After rook takes on d5, I can play knight to e4, encouraging a trade on e3. And if they do go for it, after taking on e3, rook to d8, it turns out that their rooks on the d file don't really do too much. I mean, my knight on e4 is perfectly defending the d2 square. d3 isn't really a square of interest because there's no further targets, and d1 is clearly out of the question. So I can continue on with a move like rook to f1, force the move f6, and now I can play a move like b4. And the whole point here is, again, c3 is not really a target because of this knight on e4, but also I'm just gaining space on both sides of the board, and maybe even in the future, I could play a move like knight to g3 and knight to f5, and also h4 and h5 to start targeting this king side, as if a knight gets on f5, this g7 pawn is quite weak. However, again, I ended up playing rook g to d1, so I did not go for this plan, but it was a very good one. So after rook g to d1, we see knight to e7. I end up taking on d5 and then playing knight to f3, encouraging a trade on e3. Again, the knight on e4 did look better placed, so not really the best square in my opinion. But I did have something in mind, that after taking and pawn takes on e3, and now I played the move knight to h4, but it turns out that there might have been a better move, and that is actually a5. The whole point is this knight often goes to b6, and it causes a bit of a problem because I don't really want to push the pawn afterwards as it's ready to jump to c4, but if I play a move like b3, I might be weakening my pawns a little bit on the queen side. So that actually brings something pretty important up. What if, in this position, I end up playing a move like rook d2? Well, after e4 and knight to d4, knight b6 is that problem. Now, again, it's quite clear why a5 was so decent, because now after I waste a move like b3, they're ready for h5. And after g5, unfortunately, after they take, I don't have this move knight e6, which would have been really nice, as for example, if we go all the way back, and we instead play a5 and then play e4, knight d4, and h5, we can push and go knight e6, reclaiming this pawn on g5, and white's actually pretty happy here. They can follow up even with a move like h4 next to stabilize this knight on g5, but it's not even fully necessary. But again, I missed that. So I played knight to h4 with the idea that I might want to go to g6 or I might want to go to f5. One of the big ideas is that I'm worried about the move h5 myself, so if I play knight to g6 afterwards, then everything looks okay. And instead they played king to c7, which is actually not such a great move. The problem is that I can play the move knight to g6, and after rook to e8, I can play a5 once again, and this knight on d5 is just really uncomfortably placed, whereas my knight on g6 completely prevents any counterplay on the king side where they have that pawn majority. But even though I did play the move knight to g6, I did not play a5. I played h4. The problem here is that after knight to b6, I have a choice to make. I can play something like a5, allowing knight to c4, or I can play b3, slightly weakening my queenside pawns. I ended up going for b3 as this seemed like the best option, but now after a move like knight to d7, I again have a choice. I end up playing rook to d5, and this move isn't really bad on its own, but it had an idea behind it that was pretty bad. The whole point here for me was I was ready to play a move like rook c5 check and then something like b4 or rook c4 and just push their king a little bit away. But this was a bit sloppy. After knight to b6, I can't go rook to c5 check, but I did. I actually should take on d8 and then play something like knight e7, trying to reroute to the f5 square to target g7. But instead, after rook to c5 and king to d6, going into the center, I have to play the move b4 to defend my rook. At least I thought I did, but actually again I should have just played against my instincts and played rook to a5. And after rook to a5, they can play knight to d5. So it turns out b4 is actually a bad move. I should play rook to a5, and it's still quite unpleasant. After knight to d5, rook to c1, and king to c6, I should play something like b4, just to make sure I don't lose my rook on a5. But instead, b4 was played first, and this creates a massive problem, namely the c3 pawn. They can play rook to c8, and this is something that I just simply didn't see before. After rook to c8, I went from a decent, average, equal, maybe slightly better for white position to all of a sudden being nearly lost. I played a5, trying to kick away the knight, and also setting up the trick that after rook takes on c5, pawn takes on c5, with check, king takes, and then pawn takes, I would be winning. But of course, they're not going to fall for this, as they already had tricked me. They're a decent player. So knight to d5, I took on c8, but again, maybe not the best option. Something like e4 may have been a little bit more testing, where after knight takes c3, king d3, and knight b5, I could go rook c1. Even still, to me, this looks really, really bad, but it looks a little bit better and is objectively the best way to continue the position. But again, after rook takes on c8, they can just recapture and something is hanging on the queen side. This is the big problem with rook to c5 check. I go rook to d1, trying to set something up, but of course they're not going to fall for it. They go now rook to c3, I go knight to e7, trying to get some sort of rook ending, but it's just not enough. After king takes and now rook takes on d5, they go rook c4, forcing b5, and now king to e6, which is another thing I missed. I thought here, I did see this move, that I had pawn takes on a6, but it just doesn't work. After pawn takes a6, king takes on d5, they can take, but now the move, I believe, rook to b8 just solves everything. After a6, king to c6, they're going to be rerouting, making sure they're not going in front with king to b6. This would be a massive blunder. But as long as they keep in contact with this b7 pawn with their king and eventually go up and scoop up the a6 pawn, the game is just over. So there was no hope there. And of course, a7 doesn't work because they can just move back with rook to c8. So I played rook to d8. Losing another pawn is not great, and also my g4 and h4 pawns are weak. They take on b5 instead, and I think that this is a very decent approach. They're just trying to minimize any counterplay. g4 and h4 aren't providing any counterplay for them, so why even worry about it? I go rook to b8, again trying to maintain activity. They go rook to c7, and I go king to e4, trying to get a little bit of activity, maybe with king e4. They go h5, and this kind of was not the best move for them. The reason why is because it does give me a little bit of counterplay, but then again, I am completely losing, and maybe I shouldn't be the one judging at all. But let's see exactly why this might not be so great. After taking on h5, they play king f5, and then I set up a trick with rook to g8. This is the only reason I think that this may not be the best idea for them, by the way. The whole point here now is that after b4, which is what they play, if they end up playing a move like king to g4 after e4 check, then they're going to be in trouble. King g4 actually loses the game to h6. All of a sudden, I'm the one winning because this pawn is actually going to promote. If they ever try pushing along, then, well, yeah, this just doesn't work either. I can go rook to g7. They can move away if they want to, but then h7 and rook to g8 will be coming, as well as even a move like rook takes on b7. So they can't really allow this, and why would you in the first place? So after e4 check, they go to f4 instead. You know, they didn't really fall for the trick as expected, and I played rook b8, b3, and after a6 and b2, I end up resigning because this is just hopeless at this point. I did have that one little trick that I tried to go for with h6 and hoping for h7, but it just didn't really pan out, sadly. So it's time to sign the score sheets, so to say. And the whole thing here to mention is that I could push with a7, but when they promote with check, even if they don't win this pawn, I'm just getting checkmated pretty quickly here, as we can see. I mean, I'll just try to calculate it right now. Something like this looks good enough. Check here, forced to this rank, and just checkmate. And it's just the mate in one no matter what. They could even go queen h1 if I went to f1. Not too important. But yeah, again, it all stemmed from that really critical moment when I played rook c5 check. It looked very innocuous, but it had a massive drawback and ended up costing me the entire game, despite being pretty fine up until then. So just remember, if it's an equal position and you're ready to play a normal looking move, be careful. Just be careful. That's all I gotta say. I hope you guys enjoyed this game, and I'll see you in the next one where we finish out the tournament. Have a good one, guys.